Hello and welcome. Greek great Aristotle had said that poverty is the parent of revolution and crime. Mario Puzo, in his epic Godfather, had said that behind every successful fortune, there is crime. If one views both of these together and analyzes, they don't seem to be contradictory. In fact, they seem to be representing the two ends of a spectrum between which crime has thrived for time immemorial, since the times when there were no crime laws to define what was crime. Welcome to this English avatar of Crimetak. A Hindi version is run by my colleague Shams Tahir Khan, immensely popular, extremely well researched, diverse, and that is why very popular. I have been a political journalist for over 3 decades, and that is why I know a thing or two about crimes which are parented by politicians or politics. And for the debut episode of English version of Crimetak, I have picked up an incident that happened 30 years ago, little over that. And it involved crimes against people, crimes against the state, and also crime against democracy. I will rewind to February 1990. I was a cub reporter, barely 4 years old in this profession, and working with the first private TV news venture, path-breaking news track. It was news packaged in a video cassette. At that time, it was VHS. And it was again a pioneering effort by who else but the India Today group. The incident made global headlines. Many people were killed. There were political killings. It was called Meham in Meham, a small assembly constituency in Rohtak district in Haryana, very close to Delhi. It was parented by politics of Lutyens Delhi, where I sit. Riding an extremely persuasive campaign on the Bofors scandal, VP Singh had become Prime Minister, and his deputy was Devi Lal, the Jat Lord of Haryana. He had shifted base sometime in December 1989 to Delhi to take charge as the Deputy Prime Minister of a coalition which even involved the BJP. And at that time, in a dynastic switch, he had made Om Prakash Chautala, his son, as the Chief Minister of Haryana. Om Prakash Chautala took over on 2nd December 1990, but he was not a member of any of the houses. So he had to get elected as per the rules within the next 6 months. Chautala wanted to contest from the Meham constituency. That was his father's home turf. But at that time, since Devi Lal had moved to Delhi, the powerful super panchayat called the Meham Chobisi had decided that Anand Singh Dangi, who was the chairman of the Haryana Service Selection Board at that time, would be their choice. In fact, nearly 2,000 odd leaders from the Chobisi landed up at Devi Lal's home in Delhi and conveyed the decision to him that it's not going to be Chautala, it is going to be Anand Singh Dangi who is going to be their chosen one. But Devi Lal wanted his son and his son to take charge of Haryana. And he followed the call of the heart, the line of the blood, and did not follow the diktat of the clan. And that is why Anand Singh Dangi entered the fray against Om Prakash Chautala as an independent rebel candidate. The Election Commission fixed the date for 27th of February. Before the election date, there was tremendous amount of friction between the cadres, the administration and others. Come poll day, I was a young reporter. It was a by-poll. Not very significant, although the sitting Chief Minister was contesting to remain Chief Minister. I, along with a team comprising of 3 members at that time, it used to be called a low band recording system. We landed up in Meham. And in the morning, when we reached there, the atmosphere was terribly surcharged. There was friction between cadres almost everywhere. There were policemen who was trying to stop the cadres from flocking around the polling booths. By the time it was 11 o'clock in the afternoon, we found that things were getting out of control. Things were getting out of control not because there were mobs, because the police was behaving in a partisan manner. After all, the Chief Minister had to get elected, so the police knew what exactly they had to do. So at many places, there were complaints by Anand Singh Dagi faction that the police was stopping the voters from entering polling booths. They were intimidating voters. There were complaints even that policemen were forcing voters inside polling stations that they should not be voting for Anand Singh Dagi. We heard a lot of complaints at several places we reached. We shot places where there were friction happening. At places we found there were fisticuffs. There were lathi charge by policemen. And throughout the day, there were complaints of rigging at polling stations, polling officials being intimidated, they being chased out, ballot papers and ballot boxes. Yes, those were the days when ballot boxes were still used for polling. And there was snatching of polling boxes happening. By the time the evening came and dusk fell, there was a very clear indication that there has been large-scale tampering as far as the voting system has been concerned. The Election Commission in a late evening meeting took a call and decided that in two segments, especially one segment called the Baisi area, where in the Meham constituency there has been a lot of rigging and poll malpractice. And that is why a repoll in 8 polling booths was ordered within the Meham constituency. Now, a countermanded election perhaps is more interesting, but repolling in 8 polling stations does not really make news. So, it was just gut feeling, perhaps a young reporter's enthusiasm to be part of the polling process, even though there may not be something very significant happening there. I landed up, but this time around, perhaps acting on a hunch, I took 2 camera teams with me. That means it was a 7-member team. There were 2 cameramen with me who are today in the market as one of the most senior cameramen, Ajmal Jami and Narendra Gudavali with me. And there were other news track teams with me. When we landed at Meham, we went straight for the Baisi, the polling booths in the Baisi area. It was sometime around 9 o'clock when we were stopped outside a polling station. There was a large police posse. The policemen did not allow us to enter and they held us at bay. Suddenly, 2 men came running out of the polling station. And their charge was that they were polling agents and they have been chased out because certain officials have entered inside and they were sitting inside while the polling agents, polling officials were being made to stand as bystanders, and these officials were stamping ballot papers and dumping them inside the ballot boxes. We got them on camera. And then we were chased away because we were shooting incriminating evidence at the polling station by the policemen. We landed up at another polling station. This time, there was a small gathering of policemen outside and it was virtually desolate. There were no voters and there was not even a curious onlooker in that area. There were several police vehicles parked outside and we peeped inside from the window and we actually saw that there were few officials inside. The polling officials were sitting in the corner on their haunches and one by one, ballot papers were being stamped and they were being dumped inside the ballot boxes. We filmed it and then we made good escape from there without anybody noticing us. Suddenly, we were standing at a crossing in the Baisi area when someone came and told us that there was violence happening inside the village. So, leaving one camera team outside, I went inside the village and I found that on a charpai, as it is called in the area, a cot, there was the mortal remains of a person. A person was lying dead, flies all over him. He was bleeding from all over his body. He had injuries on his head. One of his eyes was virtually gouged out. He had stab wounds in his stomach. And there were some family members who were crying around him. So when we asked him what had happened, we were told that there was a clash between Anand Singh Dangi men and Chautala men. And allegedly, this is what the family members alleged, that Chautala men had used jeli. It's a farm implement. It's like a pitchfork. While a pitchfork has 3 to 4 sharp edges on one end, at the functioning end of the pitchfork, jeli has 2. It's used to raise hay when the thrashing process is on. It's a sharp weapon, and it can be used as a weapon to kill. And that's the first time I realized it. And I found that this person was stabbed multiple times in his stomach, abdomen and chest with jelis, and was beaten with lathis, and there were telltale injuries on his head. While we were filming it, suddenly we heard a commotion, barely 400 meters away. And we turned, and I yanked Naren Guravali, who was my cameraman, to catch the action. We found that a man was chased by nearly 10 to 15 men. He fell, and then those men who were chasing him rained lathi blows on him. They kept hitting him. They kept hitting him. He kept screaming. He kept shouting for help. Nobody, there were some people who were watching from a distance, and nobody moved, barring that those people who were hitting him and the person who was being beaten. Suddenly 3-4 men came, and jelis in their hands, and they started hitting him with jelis in his stomach, on his face, all over his body. Soon that person was virtually immobile. And then we asked the curious onlookers that who was this man? We were told that this was the other side retaliating. Means it was allegedly the Dangi men this time around retaliating for the killing and killing the man who belonged to the Chautala camp. While this commotion was on, there was one dead body on this side, 400 meters, another dead body with men with lathis and pitchforks still standing around them. We heard the screeching sound of few vehicles. And there were nearly 8 and 9 of them. And a lot of men came out. There were a couple of escorting policemen with them. And 2 powerful, important-looking men came out with gunmen. And they started indiscriminately firing. One of the men fell. One of the men who was standing and hitting that man with lathis fell. These men then rushed towards that group of men, continuously firing at them. We were filming it, but suddenly 3-4 policemen came and stopped us, pushed us, and pinned us. In fact, snatched one of the cameras. And then we continued hearing firing. From a distance, we could see 2 more people fall, 1 man. We found that a young girl who was standing at the door of a house with a mother screaming for, asking her to come inside. One of the bullets hit her. And it is then that the bullets fell silent. And then that group of men which had run in with the bullets, they turned back towards us. We were unwanted. And at that time, we used perhaps the lax policemen and the lack of attention on us to slip away. We got in our car and they went to another area in Bansi constituency area. And there on the main road, we found that several shops were on fire. And there was a large posse of nearly 200 odd policemen, which was firing in the air, which was firing on people. And we saw that 2 people died in that firing. And we even saw that one of the men was lifted by the policemen and thrown into one of the burning shops. We were intent on shooting what was happening at that time. All of us were young. We hadn't seen something as gory and as murderous as this. While we were intent on shooting it, I suddenly saw from the corner of my eyes nearly 20 to 25 policemen rushing towards us. And since I was covering crime already, from the epaulets on his shoulder, I could realize it was a sub-inspector. He came shouting, hurling abuses at us. And I took out my proudly owned press card to show him that we were media people. But in chaste Haryanvi, he abused us. And he said that why the hell are we there? And he asked us to surrender our camera and footage. Now that's a no-no for a journalist. So I insisted that that's not going to happen. In the meanwhile, he gestured to his policemen who started snatching the camera, attempting to snatch the camera from Ajmal Jami, my cameraman. There was Jagmohan, our sound recordist, and there was Pradeep Gupta, one of our other light assistant. They were trying to ensure that the camera is not snatched. It is then I rushed towards them and I stood between the policemen and the camera team. And then one of the policemen, I think at the orders of the sub-inspector, because there was a lot of screaming and shouting going on, I couldn't hear, hit the first blow on my head. So he hit his lathi on the right side of my head, and I could instantly feel that there was blood coming out of it. And then hell broke loose. 20 of them pounced on us, raining lathis, and they started hitting Jami, my cameraman, and the camera fell. The camera used to be not a single component unit at that time. It used to have a camera and a recorder connected to it. The recorder also fell. And there were raining blows on the camera then. The idea was to finish off the footage. But in the policeman's zeal, they didn't know that those recorders were built like a tank. And I realized that perhaps it's the end of the camera and the recorder, but perhaps the tape could be salvaged. And I turned and I fell over the recorder. And I pushed the eject button. I took out the tape. And while they were hitting me, I hid it inside my jacket. And suddenly, one policeman who was carrying a rifle, a 303 in his hand, in Haryanvi said, "Ki saade ne tape kaad li hai." That means he has taken the tape out. And he hit me, he reversed his rifle and he hit me on the other side of my head. By that time, beaten and bruised, Badri, my sound recordist, Jagmohan, Ajmal Jami were chased out from there. The camera was in ruins, completely shattered. And I started with the tape tucked under my armpit inside the jacket. I started running. Nearly 10 of them started chasing me. But I was 26 then, fitter, younger, and I outran them. All of us ran for nearly 1.5 kilometers. There were people from homes, scared to even lend a helping hand or even challenge what the police was doing. Such was the reign of terror on that day, February 28th, 1990. Our driver was a brave man. And he realized there was something happening. He had come close and he saw what was happening. He zoomed in his car. We opened the doors and we got inside somehow. And the driver turned the vehicle and it started speeding away. But Delhi was on this side. We were on the other side, heading into Rohtak and deeper into Haryana. It did not end there. Policemen chased us. They got a jeep and they started chasing us. I had 2 serious head injuries. My Badri, my sound recordist, had injuries on his head. Jami, my cameraman, had bruises all over. But I think he was the sharpest and most alert among us at that time. And he told us that it seems that they were firing on us. We drove like mad. After nearly driving for a couple of kilometers, when we were reaching the end of the Meham constituency, There was a police picket. There was a police jeep, few policemen, and few drums which were stationed on the road. And we realized that they may stop us. But perhaps the wireless system was not as good at that time. Perhaps the police was too keen on getting us at that time. They had not alerted the policemen at the picket and the barricade. And we somehow managed to zoom past. We didn't know where we were going. I was young and it was my first trip to Haryana as a journalist. The driver also was not very familiar with the area. We drove. We just kept on driving with a jeep chasing us. We drove, I don't know, I don't recall how long. Suddenly we saw that on the right, there was a board indicating something about an army cantonment or an army unit on the right. We turned into that. I told the driver to turn towards the right, hoping that if there is an army cantonment, perhaps we might escape those who were chasing us. It was a dilapidated old ambassador car, and perhaps I think strongly built, that we managed to somehow reach a point where there was activity, there were certain vehicles, and then we realized that the police jeep had stopped chasing us. We turned back and we didn't know what to do, because if we had to get back to Delhi, we had to cross Meham, and we knew that the cops would be looking for us. We had that valuable footage still tucked inside my jacket under my armpit. So we started driving away from Delhi towards some place. We came to a small kasbah. We found a small hospital, and we went inside and looking for first aid. But by that time, everybody had realized that we were victims of pole violence, perhaps even police. And the doctors there at the hospital refused to give us first aid. There was fear written all over. Disappointed, we left that place and we drove. Suddenly, we had driven few kilometers and I saw a vehicle stationed with a red cross, that red cross painted on the sides. So I asked the driver, was it a doctor? Was it an emergency van? So he told us that it is part of that maternity apparatus in Haryana, where if there is a home delivery for a pregnant lady, these vehicles come with a doctor and an attendant, and they have the delivery inside at the village in case of an emergency. We went inside. There was a baby child which was born, newborn child. The doctor just had washed her hands, was wiping her hands in a towel. She saw us. She was sympathetic. And I think she came over all the fears, and she was nice enough to agree to give us stitches on her head and first aid. But she had a problem. She had a problem. Medical services were not as good at that time. She did not have anesthesia to administer those sutures on her head. And my sound recorder is Badri's head. So there was a choice of bleeding longer. We were already bleeding for some 3-4 hours, or getting stitches without anesthesia. She said, I'll do it softly. I took her word, and she gave me 17 stitches and nearly 7-8 stitches to my sound recordist Badri. The locals were very helpful. They gave me a glass full of warm milk laced with turmeric, and the local old gentleman, who was, I think, 70, 75, told me that this is the best they can do and it will really help us. It did. It really helped us. We gained energy, we drove somehow, and we started approaching Delhi from the other border. We drove through a long time, and we somehow crossed the border. There were checks, but we put on some caps which we had bought, not to show the bandages on the head. We stuck the tapes inside the rear seat. There used to be springs in those. We hid the tapes there. We crossed the border, and we called up our office, News Track office. And we reached office well past midnight. There was a large posse of media men. We told them the story of what had transpired. There were 2 other journalists we found later who were beaten up there. We were told next morning that officially 10 people had died. Our cameras were written off. But locals say that 24 people had died on both the sides. Now, despite all that incident, since Devi Lal was the Deputy Prime Minister, the government could not move in because it was a question of his son continuing as Chief Minister. And Newstrack became a household name that day, next morning. It was perhaps the first poll violence story, violence during a poll captured on camera, away from those days of Doordarshan news. And people of India saw for the first time that if they heard about poll violence, this is how it happens. If they heard of polling ballot papers being snatched, this is how it happens. If they'd heard about powerful men in politics dictating and subverting mandate of the people, this is how it happens. The election was countermanded because of the violence that day happened and the incriminating evidence that India Today had. India Today had to face the wrath of the administration. India Today's publication house was in Haryana. The local goons harassed us. The printing had to be stopped for certain days. There was virtually no probe. Media men, public pressure, editorials were written. And eventually, the Home Minister met journalists and others, and there were demands that something needs to be done. A sitting judge of the High Court, Punjab and Haryana, was appointed, and an inquiry was ordered. But Chotala continued as Chief Minister for a little while. Then came, this is not the end of the Meham story. This is not the end of the violence for ensuring that Chotala remained Chief Minister. There was another election called, and because Chotala had to be elected, and this time around, Chotala still wanted to continue from Meham, so a dummy candidate was fielded by Chotala's party. And Amar Singh, if the election was to be held on May 21st, if I recall rightly, 1990, on 16th May, Amar Singh, the candidate, was killed. And in reprisal, the police raided the Madina home of Anand Singh Dagi, the candidate who had contested against Chotala in Meham. And there was firing again. There were 3 people killed again. There was a lot of political din raised. And another inquiry was ordered. But eventually, the matter came to the CBI. For years, the CBI probed the matter. The Narasimha Rao government came to power in 1991. There were judicial inquiries again. But by the end of it, CBI could not find evidence to prosecute those accused in the case. The policemen, the DIG, the officials, they could not find evidence. The court inquiries first could not find anything. Bhajan Lal, who became Chief Minister after Om Prakash Chotala, scrapped that inquiry, rejected it, founded another inquiry, but that also didn't bring up anything. Eventually, what happened on 27th of February and 28th of February 1990, when people were killed, democracy was subverted and undermined, there was no prosecution. But, though Mario Puzo may have said that behind successful ventures, there is crime, Chotala didn't last very long. He had to resign. And that perhaps is because of the footage India Today has secured. It had brought to people what transpired on those 2 days in Meham in Haryana. That's the story of Meham in Meham. We'll be back with more. We'll be back with more story where parent of crime is politics and politicians. Have a nice weekend.